All right, again, thank you everyone for joining us. This is the Tenants' Rights and Responsibilities webinar, and we'll be talking about the City of Mountain View's Rent Stabilization Program.
Hola, buenas noches. Muchas gracias por unirse con nosotros. Este webinario será de derechos y responsabilidades del inquilino y vamos a estar hablando sobre la ciudad de Mountain View.
And first, we'll start out with introductions. We have myself, Andrea Kennedy. I work for the City of Mountain View's Rent Stabilization staff. We also have translating for us in Spanish throughout the webinar, Alitzel Camacho, who also works with the Rent Stabilization staff.
Vamos a empezar con introducciones con el personaje de la ciudad de Mountain View. Vamos a empezar con Andrea Kennedy, que trabaja con la ciudad de Mountain View con la renta estabilización. Y Alitzel Camacho, que va a hacer traducción.
And just as a reminder before we get started, city staff is not able to offer any legal advice, but we do offer facts, best practices, and an overview of the Csfra and other state laws.
Vamos a hacer un recordatorio que el personaje de la ciudad no puede ofrecer consejo legal, pero podemos ofrecer datos, mejores prácticas y una visión general de Csfra y otras leyes estatales.
Okay, so this is an example slide for a question. So anytime we finish the section, we'll ask for questions. So you can type your question in the Q&A. You can raise your hand, or if you're joining us on the phone, dial *9 and we can patch you through to speak.
En esta presentación es un ejemplo de si tienen alguna pregunta. Primero, si tienen alguna pregunta, lo pueden hacer un comentario en el Q&A, o también pueden levantar su mano o marcar *9 si están llamando con su teléfono.
And we do have a request here asking for us to put on the caption. So just give me 1 second while I do that.
Tenemos una sugerencia de que agreguemos las capciones.
Okay, did that work? Okay, I see that the captions are on. Please let me know in the chat or the Q&A if you don't see the captions, and I'll try to figure that out.
Por favor, déjenos saber en el Q&A si no ven los títulos para que tratemos de ver qué está pasando.
Thank you. Thank you for letting us know as well.
Gracias y gracias por avisarnos.
Okay, and just before we get started, I wanted to mention, since we are on Zoom, if for some reason our connection gets lost or drops, please just log back on using the same link, and we'll pick up right where we got started.
Antes que empecemos, si se pierde la conexión, por favor, sálganse del enlace y ingresen otra vez en el mismo enlace y vamos a empezar de donde nos quedemos.
So we're going to start out today by talking a little bit about the background of the Community Stabilization and Fair Rent Act, which is also known as the Csfra. This was a voter-approved measure meant to stabilize the community by reducing housing turnover in certain covered rental units. And it does that in 3 ways. First, by stabilizing rent, so it limits the amount of rent increase that can be put on any unit. It provides eviction protection. And finally, ensures a fair rate of returns for property owners on their rental investment property.
Vamos a empezar con un poco de antecedente. Una medida aprobada por los votantes para estabilizar la comunidad, reduciendo la rotación de ciertas unidades de alquiler. Primero, estabilización de los alquileres. Segundo, proporcionando protecciones contra el desalojo. Y tercero, generalizar una tasa de rendimiento justa para los alquileres.
So which homes are covered by the CSFRA? Most apartment buildings in Mountain View with 3 or more rental units are covered by the CSFRA. And so these units, there's two types of coverage for these units. We have fully covered units and partially covered units. Our fully covered units are built before 1995. And these units have to abide by both the rent stabilization part of the law and the eviction protections part of the law. Now, our partially covered units are those units with 3 or more units on the property that are built after 1995. And those units only have to abide by the eviction protections part of the law.
Okay, ¿qué viviendas están cubiertas por la Csfra? La mayoría de los edificios de apartamento con 3 o más unidades están cubiertas por la Csfra. Las unidades facilitadas o financiadas por el gobierno no están cubiertas. Hay 2 tipos de unidades. Una que está totalmente cubierta, que fue construida antes del 1995, que está estabilización del alquiler y protección contra el desalojo. Y la segunda es estar parcialmente cubierta, que no es solo la mitad, que fue construida después del 1995 y solo se aplican las protecciones contra el desalojo.
All right, now as we go through the different parts of tenancy, so we'll look at what happens before you start renting, what happens while you're renting, and then sort of what happens when you're planning on vacating the unit. So we're gonna start off with what happens before you start renting the unit. I think you're on mute, sorry.
Vamos a empezar con qué pasa antes de que uno se mueva al edificio.
So first, let's talk about the screening process.
Primero vamos a hablar sobre la proyección.
So during the screening, your landlord's going to want to look for a couple of main factors while they're doing your credit check and your history check. So they're definitely going to look at your credit score, so your credit worthiness. And they're also going to look at your rental history. So that includes things like if you've ever had a past eviction. They're going to look at all of those things to determine whether or not they think you would make a good tenant for their property. They'll also look at your income to make sure you can afford the unit. But there are laws in place that make sure that the landlord is not able to discriminate based on certain protected factors. And we'll talk about that in just a second. So certain things that they will look for, of course, your name, they'll look for the ages of the occupants, your phone number. They'll ask for any prior addresses. They'll probably also ask for some references to previous rentals that you've had. They can ask for a copy of your pay stubs and the bank account number to make sure that you income qualify. Things that they're not allowed to ask would be immigration status, familial status, ethnicity, any medical information, or copies of your actual bank statement.
So en la proyección hay muchas cosas que el alquiler va a estar viendo sobre su aplicación. Van a empezar con una solvencia de crédito, historial de alquileres para ver dónde más han vivido y para ver cómo es eso, y también los desalojos anteriores, ingresos, para ver que sí pueden ofertar la vivienda, pero lo que no van a hacer, no van a discriminar. Y en este proceso va a ser lo que está bien que ellos se fijen en su aplicación, serían nombres, edades de los ocupantes, número de teléfonos, dirección anterior, copia del recibo de sueldo, número de cuenta bancaria, pero lo que no está bien que pregunten sería el estado de inmigración, situación familiar, etnia, información médica, copias de extractos bancarios.
So again, like I was mentioning, there are some protections in place from federal and state law that protect against certain types of discrimination. So certain types of things that are arbitrary, that you can't help, or that don't really have any bearing on whether or not you'd be a good tenant. So those would be things like your race or the color of your skin, your religion, your familial or marital status, your national origin, your primary language, of course, immigration status, your gender, your sexual orientation, or your gender identity. Also, they're not able to look at things like your possible disabilities or your age and your sources of income. They're not allowed to deny your application because of how you get your money.
So, hemos comentado sobre hay cosas que un arrendador no puede ver y hay leyes que los protegen. Hay unas de esas cosas que no pueden discriminar a uno, sería por el color de la raza, religión, estado familiar y civil, origen nacional, idioma principal, estatus de inmigración, sexo, orientación sexual, identidad de género, edad o discapacidades, arbitrario y fuentes de ingresos.
And I did also want to mention that the city works very closely with an organization called Project Sentinel, who has a fair housing division. So if you are experiencing any sort of discrimination based on any of these things, you can definitely reach out to us and we can connect you to the Fair Housing Division of Project Sentinel.
También quería comentar que la ciudad de Mountain View también trabaja cercamente con el proyecto Centenal, que ellos tienen una división de discriminación y vivienda justa, y nosotros podemos conectarlos si ustedes ocupan esa ayuda.
All right, before we go into the rental agreements, let me stop here to see if there's any questions. If there are, go ahead and raise your hand or dial *9 to speak, or you can type in the Q&A.
Antes que empiece con la otra sección, quiero ver si tienen alguna pregunta. Pueden usar el Q&A para hacer preguntas, alzar la mano o llamar a estrella 9 si están usando el teléfono.
Okay, seeing none, we'll go ahead and continue.
No veo ninguna. Vamos a continuar con la presentación.
All right, so first thing we're going to talk about are lease agreements. So your lease agreement is very important. It's going to be the document that is going to describe very specific things about the terms of your rental. So whether you pay month to month or whether you have a year lease or a 6-month lease, that's all going to be inside of your lease. It will also have the name of the owner or the company that you will be paying your rent to, that is your landlord. It should have information like who, where, and what day of the month you are to pay your rent. It'll definitely have your rent amounts. Any utilities that may be included or not included in your apartment will be written in your lease. Your security deposit amounts, if you're allowed to sublet, so if you're allowed to rent your unit to another person. It will also include any fees like parking fees, pet fees, storage fees. Also have disclosures and things like house rules that will all be in writing in your lease. And this is what you sign before you start renting the unit so that you know all the details of the unit and the rules of the apartment complex.
Vamos a hablar sobre las disposiciones del contrato de arrendamiento. Este contrato se firma antes que ustedes se muevan a la vivienda para que sepan las reglas. Y en este contrato van a ver si va a ser un contrato de mes a mes o un plazo fijo de alquiler, si es por año o mes por mes. También en ese contrato va a decir los nombres del propietario y del agente, a quién y dónde y cuándo pagar el alquiler, importe del alquiler, servicios públicos, importe de depósito, subalquiler, tarifas, divulgaciones y también reglas de la casa.
And we really encourage renters and even people who are renting a room to have some type of lease in writing, because that's the document that we're going to look at when we determine your rent increase amount.
Nosotros subimos a cualquier inquilino, aunque sea si estás rentando un cuarto, a tener algo escrito para que sepan dónde están las reglas y así vayan de acuerdo.
And this is really important to remember. Even though you sign your lease, you cannot actually waive any of your rights by this document. So if you have rights in the law, regardless if the lease says something else, you're always going to keep those rights and you'll always be able to come back and exercise those rights if something is unlawful. So that's just an important thing to remember. Even if you sign the lease, you can still be protected by the law.
Un recordatorio es que los inquilinos no pueden renunciar a sus derechos mediante la firma del contrato. Esto quiere decir que aunque ustedes ya firmaron el contrato, hay derechos que ustedes tienen como inquilinos y que los protegen. Y aunque esté el contrato firmado, si algo está hecho ilegal, tienen todavía sus derechos afuera de su contrato.
All right, so under our local rent stabilization law, let's talk about who is allowed to live in your unit. So if you sign the lease with your name on it, there are still some people you can bring in, even if they're not on the lease. So there are eligible family members. That would include if you have a child, your parents, a sibling, or a grandparent. You can bring them into your house as long as you don't exceed the number of people who are allowed to be in that size apartment. We can go one by one.
Okay. Vamos a ver quién puede vivir en la unidad. Primero, miembros de la familia elegibles. Aviso obligatorio al propietario. También tienen que el propietario puede solicitar documentación razonable.
And also there are replacement roommates. So if you came into your lease with a roommate and your roommate moves out, you have the ability to bring in another roommate that can replace the original roommate, a one-for-one trade in a way. But for both of these, you have to notice your landlord, and the landlord may request backup documentation for screening or to prove that they are an eligible family member.
La segunda opción es sustitución del compañero de vivienda. Usted si tiene si tiene un compañero viviendo con usted, se puede cambiar. Si ese compañero se va, puede traer a otro, pero usted está obligado a avisarle al propietario. El propietario puede también realizar una selección de inquilinos.
So the other thing is subletting, or if you're going to add a roommate if your lease allows it. So this is something that is either allowed or not allowed, but it would be in your lease. If you can sublet and you choose to sublet your apartment, the total rent that you charge your subtenant cannot be more than the amount that the original landlord is charging. So you can't be making a profit off of your unit, right? And also if the landlord requests to see the lease that you made with your subtenant, they can request to look at that.
La tercera sería subalquiler, compañeros de vivienda solo cuando el contrato de arrendamiento lo permite. Solamente si su contrato dice que puede rentar, sí se puede, pero si no está en el contrato no es legal. La renta del subalquiler no puede superar la renta total que el inquilino original debe pagar al propietario. So, no pueden estar haciendo más dinero de lo que usted paga de renta. Y también la divulgación de las condiciones de alquiler si se solicita. So, si su alquiler le pide ver el contrato que usted hizo con el nuevo compañero que está rentando, él tiene el derecho de mirar ese contrato.
All right, any questions about the lease or any questions about who's allowed to, who you're allowed to bring into your rental unit?
¿Tienen alguna pregunta sobre el contrato de arrendamiento o quién ustedes pueden traer a su vivienda? Pueden comentar su pregunta en el QA o alzar su mano o llamar a 9 si están llamando por teléfono.
Okay, I'm not seeing any, so I'll go ahead and keep going.
No estoy viendo ninguno, so vamos a continuar con la presentación.
So now let's talk about what happens during your tenancy after you sign the lease and you've moved in.
Ahora vamos a hablar durante el alquiler, ya que hayan firmado el contrato y ya que se hayan movido a su nueva vivienda.
All right, we'll talk about rent payments and rent increases.
Vamos a hablar sobre el pago del alquiler y aumentos.
Okay, so in our rent stabilization law, we have a term we call base rent. And this is the rent amount that we calculate all of our rent increases from. So if you've been in your rental unit for a while, you'll see here the base rent will equal the amount of rent that you paid on October 19, 2015. So that would be your base rent. If you're newer to your rental apartment, your base rent will equal the initial amount of rent that you paid when you moved in at the start of your tenancy.
Vamos a hablar sobre el base del alquiler. Si el arrendamiento comenzó en o antes del 19 de octubre de 2015, el base del alquiler sería el alquiler en vigor el 19 de octubre de 2015. Si el arrendamiento comenzó después de octubre 19 del 2015, el base de alquiler sería el alquiler inicial al inicio del arrendamiento.
So once you move in and we have your base rent, your allowed rent increases are going to be set each year around the summertime. So this year, the rent increase is 5%. And that rent increase can first go into effect September 1st of 2022. And things to remember that your rent increases can be banked and given at a later time. So if your landlord hasn't used some of the past rent increases, they can hold them and apply them at a later date, okay? Your annual rent increases total cannot exceed 10% for 1 year. So it has to be lower than 10%. And you're only allowed to have one rent increase every 12 months. So for example, if you get a rent increase this coming September 2022, you cannot have another rent increase until September 2023. And all of your rent increases must have a 30-day written notice before the rent increase is given.
Ok, vamos a hablar sobre los aumentos de alquileres permitidos. Aquí está una tarifa de los aumentos que han sido los años anteriores. Ahorita en el año 2022, el porcentaje que está permitido de aumento sería el 5%. Esto va a tomar lugar hasta septiembre 1, 2022. Tenemos que recordar de que los AGAs pueden ser guardados por los propietarios y los pueden dar más tarde. También el incremento anual, incluyendo los AGAs, se pueden ser acumulados, pero tampoco pueden superar el 10%. Y la tercera sería, se permite un aumento cada 12 meses. También hay que avisar por escrito al inquilino con 30 días antes de que sea efectivo el aumento. Un ejemplo del aumento sería si le dieron un aumento en septiembre 1, 2022, su próximo aumento no puede ser hasta septiembre 1, 2023.
All right. So there are a couple of options and protections for tenants for either rent increases that are not allowed under the law, or if you get too many banked rent increases and it causes a hardship for you. So if that is your situation, you can file a petition with the city for a downward adjustment of rent or to reduce your rent. So the first option here to reduce rent is an unlawful collection of rent. So if, for example, your landlord is charging an amount over the allowed percentage, you can come to the city and we can help you file a petition to get the rent reduced back down to what's allowed in the law. The other example is an undue hardship petition. So if you get a banked rent increase, so a couple of rent increases that you hadn't been given in previous years and they give them all together, if that's causing a financial hardship, you can come to the city and file a petition for those banked rent increase amounts. And it's possible that either they'll be delayed or you get less of an increase, something that you can financially handle.
Vamos a hablar sobre las peticiones de inquilinos. Esta petición de ajuste de rebaje del alquiler. Ustedes como inquilinos tienen derecho a hacer una petición con la ciudad de Mountain View. Y una razón sería por un cobro ilegal de alquileres. Si su propietario le está dando un aumento que es fuera del porcentaje que está, entonces eso sería ilegal y puede hacer una petición para recordar ese fondo para atrás. Falta de mantenimiento de locales habitables, disminución de los servicios o del mantenimiento de la vivienda, o dificultad financiera por si si les dieron un aumento de más del 10% porque el propietario los guardó, se los quiere dar todos juntos, pero eso causa dificultades financieras en su hogar familiar. Entonces usted puede pelear para que se lo den más tarde los incrementos de renta.
All right, next we'll talk about habitability.
Próximamente vamos a hablar sobre condiciones habitables.
So let's first talk about things that your landlord would be responsible for keeping up in your apartment. So they are the landlord, they are required to provide a rental unit that is in habitable condition. So that means that everything is up to a standard that makes it safe for you to live in. So that includes things like making sure there are no vermin or rodents or garbage laying around, that the plumbing and gas is working correctly and is safe, that all of your doors and windows lock, that things like the roof and the exterior walls are in good condition and have been maintained. You are also required to have electricity and heating and hot water in your apartment so that you can live a healthy and safe lifestyle at your apartment.
Responsabilidades del propietario. Proporcionar unidades del alquiler en condiciones habitables, un lugar seguro para que ustedes puedan vivir, es la responsabilidad del propietario. Tiene que tener fontanera y gas, no hay almañas y basura, cierre de puertas y ventanas tienen que estar funcionando, techo, paredes y extranjeros, calefacción y electricidad y derecho a agua caliente.
There are also some things that you as a tenant are responsible for. So you are responsible for taking care of your rental unit and the common areas that you have access to. And if there is something that's gone wrong, you are responsible to notify your landlord quickly when a problem arises. Also, as the tenant, you are responsible for any damage caused by you or your guests or children or any pets that you own. So you would be responsible for repairing those or paying for those repairs in your rental unit.
También hay responsabilidades para los inquilinos. Cuidar razonablemente la unidad de alquiler y las zonas comunes. Tienen que notificar rápidamente a su arrendador cuando surjan problemas. Y también son responsables de los daños causados por el inquilino o sus invitados, niños o mascotas.
So there's a couple things that we recommend that you do before you move in, and that is perform a thorough walkthrough inspection. So you want to make sure at the beginning and at the end of your tenancy that you really document the condition of your unit. So you can do that by a checklist that usually your landlord will provide. And also you could take photos and videos of the condition of the apartment. The other thing that we encourage is renter's insurance. And it's usually pretty affordable and it can protect against personal property damage. The other thing that we always recommend at the city is for our tenants and our landlords to utilize our mediation services. So these are free and confidential services that the city provides, and it helps proactively resolve disputes on a pretty short notice. So it's less adversarial than court, and it can improve the relationship between you and your landlord. And we do see a lot of tenants and landlords using these services And when they come together and find a solution that works for both of them, they usually come out with a good solution over 80% of the time.
Ok, recomendaciones. Recomendaciones que nosotros tenemos para ustedes serían realizar una inspección detallada al pie cuando ustedes vayan a moverse a un lugar al principio y final del alquiler. Documentar el estado de la unidad en una lista de comprobantes. Y esto requiere tomando fotos, videos, para que ustedes lo tengan archivado. También adquirir un seguro de alquiler asequible, protege contra los daños a los bienes personales. También les recomendamos que utilicen el programa de meditación que tiene la ciudad de Mountain View. Es gratuito para los inquilinos. Esto ayuda a resolver de forma prácticamente los conflictos con poca antelación, y también es menos conflictivo que los tribunales y la mayoría de las relaciones. Vemos el 80% de que esto ayuda a los inquilinos y propietarios cuando ustedes vienen juntos y hablan sobre los conflictos que tengan. Hemos visto que 80% de la vez los inquilinos y propietarios llegan a una solución que funcione para los dos personas.
Okay, and there's also some tenant petitions regarding habitability. So if you're having issues with the landlord failing to maintain the habitability of the unit, or if there's been some sort of decrease in services or maintenance, then you can actually file a petition to reduce the rent for the time that this issue is happening. So for example, if there has been some sort of plumbing issue that's been going on for a while and you've asked the landlord to fix it, but they haven't, you can actually ask for a reduction in your rent for the time the problem has not been solved. Also, with the decrease in housing services, for example, if there was washing and drying machines at your apartment complex, but those were removed, you can ask for a reduction in services based on the removal of the washing machines and the dryers.
También hay peticiones de inquilinos para condiciones habitables. Eso quiere decir si falta de mantenimiento de locales habitables, como si hay un problema en su baño y usted no lo puede usar. También podemos hacer una petición para que le regresen un poco de dinero porque usted no está pudiendo usar el servicio de su casa. También si hay desmonación de los servicios o mantenimiento de la vivienda, y sería una petición de ajuste a la baja del alquiler.
So if you think that you qualify for any of these types of petition, whether it be for illegal rent or a habitability issue, you can come and see us and we can walk you through the process.
So, si usted cree que usted califica para hacer una petición o por cualquier razón de las que hemos dadoles, sería por incremento de renta ilegal o por condiciones habitables de su vivienda, nos puede venir a ver y nosotros ayudamos con ese proceso.
Okay, I'll take a pause here to check for questions.
Vamos a tomar un pausa acá para ver si hay preguntas.
So go ahead and type them in the Q&A, or if you want, raise your hand, or if you're on the phone, dial *9.
So puede irse en la QA, hacer un comentario, lo puede escribir, o también puede alzar su mano, o si está usando su teléfono, puede llamar estrella 9.
Okay, perfect. So let's move on to terminations.
Ok, perfecto. Entonces vamos a continuar con aviso de cese.
But we'll talk about just cause evictions and what sort of protections you have in Mountain View under the CSFRA.
Vamos a hablar sobre los desalojos por causa justa y cuáles protecciones ustedes tienen en Mountain View.
So under our law, there are only 9 reasons that you would be allowed to be terminated from your rental unit. And we like to break these out into 2 categories. The first category is tenant-caused termination reasons, and the second category is landlord-caused termination reasons. So under the first category would be things that you as the tenant would do that might result in getting a termination notice. That would include failure to pay rent, breach of a lease, causing a nuisance, criminal activity, or failure to give access to the landlord to the apartment complex or your unit if they need to do some sort of maintenance or inspection. You'll notice these last 4 here have a star next to them. In those cases, the landlord is required to give you a notice to cease before they give you a termination notice. And that means that they have to give you a warning notice that allows you to fix the problem before they actually give you a termination notice.
Vamos a hablar sobre solo hay 9 razones por cual uno puede ser terminado. Y hay 2 razones, causas de, sería 2 secciones. Hay causas de inquilino y causas del propietario. En el caso de inquilino es por falta de pago de alquiler, incumplimiento del contrato de arrendamiento, molestias, actividad criminal o no dar acceso. Y si ven aquí en esta presentación hay 4 estrellas al lado de las últimas 4 puntos y el propietario está requerido que se le haga una notificación de cese antes de que la notificación le entregue la notificación de terminación. También exige el pago de la ayuda. Sorry, disculpe, eso no tenía que decir.
So the next, the other reasons would be things that the landlord would do, which would cause them to need you as a tenant to move out of the unit. So if the unit required repairs that caused a temporary vacancy and you would have to leave your unit for over 30 days, they could give you a termination notice for that. The other reasons would be an owner move-in, if they're withdrawing the rental unit from the market, or if they're actually demolishing the property or your rental unit. And in all of the landlord cases, they have to offer you tenant relocation assistance. So if you income qualify, they would actually have to pay you some money in order to move out of the rental unit.
Okay, la segunda sección sería causas del propietario por reparaciones y vacantes temporales, mudanza del propietario, retirado del mercado del alquiler o demolición. Igual son las 4 estrellas al lado al último de los puntos. Habla sobre el exige el pago de la ayuda a la revocación a los hogares que cumplan los requisitos y el derecho al primer futuro.
So it's important also to know if it's not one of these 9 reasons, then the landlord is not allowed to give you a termination notice. So they can't just give you a notice to leave your unit for no reason. And the end of your lease is not a reason for you to get a termination notice. If your lease ends and you don't sign a new one, you just automatically go into month to month.
Es importante de que si no son una de esas 9 razones por cual les dan un aviso del cese, entonces sería el aviso sería ilegal y no tomará en cuenta. So es importante saber que las razones por cuales ustedes pueden ser terminados y si no están bajo esta presentación, entonces no los pueden desalojar por eso. También es importante entender que si su contrato termina, no quiere decir que ustedes se tienen que ir, solo se acaba ese contrato, pero ustedes pueden seguir viviendo en esa vivienda.
All right. And also, if the landlord gives you a termination notice, they can't just evict you by doing what we call a constructive eviction. So that would be things like changing the locks so you don't have access to your unit anymore. They can't cut off utilities on you. They can't harass you to leave. It's illegal for them to prevent you from occupying the rental unit. And they also can't leave issues with habitability unaddressed so that they make it so bad for you to live there that you just end up leaving. All of those things are not allowed and they are illegal.
So, vamos a hablar sobre los desalojos constructivos. Esos no están permitidos. Ejemplos de desalojos constructivos serían cambiar el aspecto, corte de los servicios públicos, acosar a los ocupantes, evitar la entrada de los ocupantes, problemas evitables no resueltos.
So if the landlord actually wants to remove you from the rental unit, there is only one process that they're allowed to do, and that's go through the courts. So the first step would be serving you with a termination notice. After that, they would serve you with court paperwork, which is called unlawful detainer paperwork. If you receive this paperwork, first, we encourage you to come see us so we can help you navigate it. Otherwise, you need to provide an answer to the court. If you provide an answer, they'll schedule you with a court date. And then once you have your court date, the judge will make a decision whether or not you get to stay in your unit. If you don't get to stay in your unit, then the sheriff will come and post the notice to your door and do the eviction. Right? So it's important that you do answer any paperwork you get from the court, because if you don't, it's going to go into just the judgment and you won't get a chance to show any evidence you might have or say your side of the story. The judge will just make a decision. So if you get any court paperwork, we just really recommend that you come see us and we can walk you through that process.
So, vamos a hablar sobre el proceso de desalojo. Solo hay un proceso para que un alquiler lo lleve al tribunal. Empezamos con el aviso al alquiler y llevándole una copia al comité de vivienda también. Entonces, sería una copia entregada a ustedes y una copia también al comité de vivienda. Después se le hace su servicio de Undue. Y después con ese papel, ustedes tienen que responderle al tribunal y ustedes les responden, tienen un límite de días. Después que se han sido llevados al tribunal, el juez decide si ustedes se tienen que desalojar o no. Y después de eso, cuando si el juez decide que tienen que desalojar, será llevado un aviso de parte del sheriff a su vivienda. So, es muy importante que si ustedes agarran papeles sobre desalojo, que vengan a vernos para que nosotros les ayudemos a traducir ese documento y ayudarles con el proceso.
Okay, so what should you do if you get a termination notice or if you get court paperwork? So again, I'll just say it 100 times, really contact our program immediately so that we can help you walk through the process. A lot of these documents are pretty time sensitive, So it's important that you contact us as soon as possible. Also, if you want to meet us in person, you can come to our Housing and Eviction Help Center. We hold those the first and third Thursday of every month from 1 to 5 p.m. at the Mountain View Public Library. For some reason, if these times don't work for you, just make sure to give us a call and we can set up something so that we can help you through the process.
Si usted recibe una notificación del desalojo, por favor, conéctese con nosotros, pónganse en contacto con el programa de estabilización del alquiler inmediatamente. Nos puede contactar al 650-903-6136 o también nos pueden mandar un correo al mbrent@mountainview.gov. Es muy importante que ustedes se comuniquen con nosotros rápidamente, por lo mismo que muchos de estos documentos son sensibles en tiempo, solo tienen un poco de tiempo para responder. También se puede acudir al centro de ayuda a la vivienda al desalojo. Es el primer y el tercer jueves, es de 1 a 5 p.m. y está haciendo en la Biblioteca Pública de Mountain View.
Okay, I'm not seeing any questions. I'm just going to go ahead and do the last section here. And so now we're going to talk about moving out of the rental unit.
No estoy viendo ninguna pregunta, so vamos a seguir con la presentación y se trata de después del alquiler.
Okay, so security deposits. So there are certain things that are allowed to be deducted from your security deposit when you're moving out. So those would include unpaid rent, any damages to the property, or any cleaning that needs to be done to the unit. The landlord is able to take that money out of your security deposit.
Vamos a hablar sobre el depósito de seguridad. Las deducciones permitidas son por si alquileres impagados, daños a la propiedad o limpieza. El propietario tiene derecho de hacerles estas deducciones en su depósito de seguridad.
So usually the process when you're moving out is at least 14 days before you move out, you have the option to do an inspection with the landlord, and they can let you know what they'll be reducing from your security deposit or what things you need to fix in order for you to keep that money from your security deposit. After that, you'll move out and the landlord will do a final inspection. And so they'll make a list of all the things that need to be repaired or that need to be cleaned. And they will remove that from the security deposit and return you the rest of the money, along with an itemized list of each thing that they charged you for. And this should be done within 21 days after you move out.
So, el proceso de ir para atrás su depósito de seguridad. So, tiene que ser al menos 14 días antes de la fecha de su mudanza. Sería la inspección inicial, antes que se mudan ustedes. Y después, la segunda inspección sería la fecha de salida. Y después sería la inspección final. Después habrá una devolución del depósito de seguridad con una lista detallada de las deducciones que hubo y por qué. Y esta lista y el depósito se les tiene que entregar a ustedes de entre los 21 días que usted se ha mudado.
We also encourage people, if they are having a dispute with how much they're getting back or what they're getting charged for in their security deposit, to contact our mediation program. We deal a lot with tenant-landlord disputes over security deposits.
Si usted cree que el reembolso de su depósito de seguridad no es lo que usted estaba pensando que iba a ser. Entonces también nosotros les sugerimos que contacten a la mediación de Mountain View porque ellos trabajan mucho con ese tipo de casos de depósitos.
Okay, any questions about anything we covered before we go over our resources?
¿Alguna pregunta de lo que hemos cubierto antes que sigamos con nuestros servicios?
You can go ahead and type your questions in the Q&A or raise your hand or dial *9 if you're on the phone.
Usted puede comentar en el QA, escribir su pregunta o alzar su mano o marcar en la estrella 9 si está llamando por teléfono.
Okay, perfect. Let's continue. Oh, that is actually it. Sorry about that. I thought there was another slide. This is the end of the presentation. So I'll go ahead and leave it up on this slide because if you see at the bottom right here, there is our contact information. So that's our phone number and our email address. And we really encourage you to reach out with us if you are experiencing any issues with any of the topics that we covered today.
Esa fue la última sección de nuestra presentación. Vamos a dejarle esta presentación abierta por si ustedes se quieren contactar con nosotros. Dice nuestro número de teléfono y nuestro correo electrónico donde ustedes pueden contactarse con nosotros.
Are there any final questions before we end for the evening?
¿Hay alguna pregunta antes que acabemos con la junta?
And go ahead and feel free to ask your question in English or Spanish. Either way, we can translate.
Pueden hacer su pregunta en inglés o en español. Podemos hacer traducción.
Okay, I'm not seeing any questions, so we'll go ahead and end it. I really appreciate everybody taking the time out tonight to learn a little bit more about the details of our rent stabilization law and what your rights are under this law. So thank you for coming out, and I hope you have a great evening. And of course, remember to contact us if you have any questions in the future.
Okay, les agradecemos mucho de que tomen su tiempo del día para que aprendan más sobre la estabilización de renta de Mountain View.
Good night and try to stay cool.
Buenas noches y traten de quedarse en